having the most amazing security policy in the world created is not going to be too useful until it's pushed to a firewall. And in the world of Checkpoint, we have a few options when it comes to installing a policy on a specific gateway. One of our options exists right here in the security policy itself. Over here on the right, we have a column called Install On. And by default, we have a little asterisk, and it just simply says Policy Targets, which implies every gateway that you have. So in organizations that have 2 or more gateways, it's possible that some of the entries in the security policies may not be appropriate for a specific gateway. So what we could do is we could modify for individual rules, we could modify who the targets are. So in the case of CP management, which is traffic from the management PC and from the management server going over to firewall 1 or firewall 2, the only person that really needs to implement that policy is firewall 1. So we could change the policy right here to specify that all of these rules, the parent rule and 1.1 and 1.2, should only be installed on firewall 1. And that would be part of this policy that we're working with. And we could have other rules, including inline layers that are appropriate for all the firewalls or for a group of firewalls. And once again, we can control that using the Install On column. Now, the other option is, once we have our security policies configured, when we go to install them, when we push them out, it also gives us the option there of which firewalls should get this policy. So during the install process, if we don't want a policy to be given or sent out or pushed out to a specific gateway, we simply don't put a check in the checkbox next to that gateway, and then the policy will only be pushed out to those gateways that have a check next to their names. So here on our client computer, we'll log on as admin to the management server, we'll supply our password, and click Login. Now, just for a moment, before we look at the policy, if we click over here on Gateways and Servers on the left-hand side, and we click on Firewall 1, down here in the Summary tab, it's showing us that the access control policy that's currently running on this system, it also has the date and time that that was pushed out to that system. Now, let's compare and contrast that to Firewall 2. Firewall 2 does not yet have a policy that's been pushed out from the management server. So if we go back to security policies by clicking on this tab over here on the left-hand side, and let's expand the parent rule called CP management, rule number 1, so we can see the child rules. Here in the parent rule for rule number 1, along with the sub rules for the inline layer, these are primarily applying just to firewall 1, as it's allowing traffic to go, for example, from the management PC or from the management server over to either of the 2 firewalls. In this case, primarily just firewall 2 is what we're worried about, because firewall 1 is providing the access to get to firewall 2. And rules 1.1 and 1.2 have the details regarding the policy that's going to be enforced there. So in the case of rule number 1, when we push it out, we really don't need to push it out to all the firewalls. Instead, we can push it out just to firewall 1. So for rule number 1, in the Install On column, we can click on the plus symbol, and let's go ahead and just double-click firewall 1, and then when it comes time to install this policy, that specific rule will only be applied as policy on firewall 1. And we'll do that also for 1.1 and 1.2, the 2 children. So we'll click on plus, and because we already have firewall 1 here, we can just drag and drop it down, and that'll save us a few seconds rather than clicking the plus and then grabbing it from the picker. Great, so let's go ahead and collapse rule number 1, and let's take a look at rule number 2. So if we expand rule number 2, the parent rule for rule number 2 is matching traffic that comes in on a gateway interface that's identified with the inside and is being routed out an interface associated with the outside regarding zones. And if that matches, then it kicks into 2.1 and 2.2 and etc. until there's a match. Now, if both of our gateways, firewall 1 and firewall 2, if they both had interfaces that were associated with inside and outside zones, this policy could very well apply to both of them. So in that case, we could specify that our policy targets is wide open and should go to all of our firewalls. In our case, firewall 1 and firewall 2. However, on firewall 2, if we have not associated any of its interfaces with the zone inside or outside, that's going to be a problem for firewall 2, because it's going to say, well, I don't know which interfaces we're talking about, because we haven't taken the time to identify which interfaces on firewall 2 are associated with the inside and outside zones respectively. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and publish our changes here, and we'll leave the default policy targets for rule 2, 2.1, and 2.2. And let's go ahead and click on Install Policy, and let's push the policy, or try to push the policy, out to firewall 1 and firewall 2. So if we want the policy to go to both firewalls, we'd go ahead and make sure there's a check next to both of the firewalls, and then we'll click on Install. So it has begun. It's going to attempt to push that policy out to firewall 1 and firewall 2. There's a little progress indicator down here on the bottom left, and survey says, wah, wah, wah. Installation failed. So if we click on Details, it'll bring up a new window so we can look at the details of why it failed. So here for firewall 2, if we expand that, and here it indicates rule 2 has security zone objects that are not attached to any interface used by firewall 2, inside and outside. And as a result, the policy was not pushed. So to correct that, let's click on close. So let's leave this policy as it is just for a moment, and instead of modifying the policy to only push it over to firewall 1, let's go ahead and take a moment on firewall 2 and configure E0 to be associated with the outside zone, and E1 on firewall 2 to be associated with the inside zone. So to do that, we're going to click on Gateways and Servers right here on the left-hand side. We can go ahead and double-click on firewall 2, and that will allow us to edit the details for firewall 2. We'll click on Network Management, and with Network Management selected, it's showing us the interfaces. Let's start with Ethernet 0. We can double-click on Ethernet 0 to go ahead and edit it. Under topology, just like we did in the nugget on zone-based policies, we'll click on Modify for this interface. And then we'll click on the checkbox to specify a security zone associated with E0. And then from here, we'll click on the drop-down, and we'll select Outside. And that was for E0. We'll click on OK. Confirm it's the right interface, which is always a good idea, and click OK again. And then we'll edit Ethernet 1 and specify that that interface is associated with the zone called Inside. So we'll double-click on Ethernet 1. Click on Modify in the Topology section here. Specify we want to use a security zone, and then from the drop-down, select Inside. And then click OK, and OK again, and OK again. So next, let's go back to our security policies. And now for Rule 2 and its inline layers, we could actually have this pushed out to Firewall 1 and Firewall 2, and they could both follow those rules, which would identify traffic that is initiated and coming into the firewall on an interface that's associated with the inside zone, that's going to be routed out an interface associated with the outside zone. And if that's the case, it's a match. And as a result, it would allow DNS to be forwarded. It would also allow initial sessions for HTTP or HTTPS as well. Fantastic. So we'll click on Publish. And once that's done, we'll click on Install Policy. We'll push it out to both Firewall 1 and Firewall 2 and click Install. In the bottom left, there's a little progress bar on how it's doing. We can also click on that to bring it up. And survey says, ta-da! 2 installations succeeded. That's fantastic. So if we go back to Gateways and Servers here on the top left, and we click on Firewall 2, it's now showing us that it's got an access control policy implemented on Firewall 2. In this nugget, we've taken a look at a couple options on how we can deploy policy as part of the policy itself, or during the installation phase, when we can individually select the firewalls that the policy will be pushed to. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.